When World War II entered its vicious phase in early 1942, the U.S. Army faced a thorny problem. How could an ordinary infantryman stop a tank? In Europe, Germany's Blitzkrieg had demonstrated the overwhelming power of armored forces. In just 2 years, from Poland to France, from the Balkans to Russia, sweeping panzer formations had crippled much larger armies. Infantry, armed only with rifles, light machine guns, and a few crude anti-tank weapons, became easy prey. As the Americans prepared to go into battle, they understood they needed a weapon that was cheap, light, easy to produce, and capable of giving foot soldiers confidence against tanks. In that context, at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, one morning in May 1942, an apparently ordinary event set off a revolution in infantry warfare. Colonel Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Uhl, 2 officers from the Research and Development Branch, brought a weapon that did not yet exist in the official catalog. It was not a complicated gun, nor a bulky anti-tank piece, just a hollow steel tube nearly 1.4 meters long. No tripod, no wheels, no crew required. In fact, this gun had been cobbled together in a few hours right there at the proving ground. H.L. later wrote in the ordnance records that he found a discarded steel pipe among scrap, fortunately its diameter, matched that of an experimental rocket then being developed. For a sight, he bent a wire coat hanger into a U-shape and temporarily fixed it to the tube. This was not an elaborately designed weapon, but a true patchwork creation, and that simplicity would prove to be the key. Beforehand, the U.S. Army had considered many infantry anti-tank solutions. The British had supplied a spigot mortar, a device weighing more than 45 kilos that required several men to operate and long setup times to fire. The 30-centimeter anti-tank guns, while effective against light tanks, were helpless against the increasingly thick armor of the Panzer III and Panzer IV. The only mobile weapon in infantry hands was the anti-tank grenade, but it had to be thrown at very short range, essentially a suicide mission. In that setting, Uhl's crude launch tube initially drew curiosity, but no one believed it could change the balance. The test that morning was attended by several senior officers, including Major General Gladian Barnes, head of the Ordnance Research and Engineering Division. First, they watched crews fire the spigot mortars at a running M3 Stuart tank some 150 meters away. 5 shots, 5 misses. The cumbersome weapons were hard to traverse. The complex sights cost gunners precious seconds while the tank rolled on unharmed. When it was Uhl's turn, he looked more anxious than confident. Having never tried this launcher, he feared the backblast could be dangerous, so he borrowed a welding mask for protection. He shouldered the steel tube, placed the rocket in the rear, peered through the improvised coat hanger sight, and pulled the trigger. A whoosh sounded. The rocket streaked forward, struck the tank's side, and detonated. The officers were startled. Uhl quickly loaded a second round, taking less than 5 seconds, and again hit the same spot. The proving ground fell silent for a few seconds, before Barnes approached for a closer look. The general laughed. "Looks just like Bob Burns' bazooka," referring to a homemade musical instrument made of pipes used by a popular humorist of the time. From then on, the name Bazooka stuck. That very morning, a historic decision was made, an immediate order for 5,000 units. No more red tape, no redesigns. General Electric's factories went straight into production, taking advantage of the design's simplicity. Just a steel tube, some basic welds, and a few electrical parts. Production cost was estimated at under $25 per launcher, while each rocket cost about $8. Compared with a German Panzer IV tank priced at over $40,000, the economic disparity was obvious. Only 5 months after the test, the first batch of bazookas was completed and ready for the front. This speed of weapons development, from a spur-of-the-moment idea to mass production in half a year, was unprecedented in U.S. military history. By late 1942, American arsenals contained thousands of bazookas to equip the first U.S. combat units in Europe, Operation Torch, the North Africa landings. On 8 November 1942, more than 100,000 American and British troops stormed the beaches of Algeria and Morocco, opening a new front against the Axis. Among the gear carried by soldiers of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the 1st Armored Division and the 509th Parachute Infantry were some of the first bazookas. However, an ironic mishap occurred. For secrecy, the bazookas were shipped in sealed wooden crates labeled secret, with orders not to open them before the operation. As a result, thousands of American soldiers saw the strange weapon only upon landing. With no manuals and no prior training, they had to fight and figure things out on the fly. According to the 1st Division's after-action report, many bazookas were damaged by seawater that ruined electrical batteries, causing rockets not to detonate. Some rounds went off course or detonated prematurely. Of the first 20 rockets fired by the 509th, only 7 functioned correctly. To soldiers who had never pressed the trigger on such a weapon, the bazooka at first seemed more like a gamble than a reliable armament. Even amid that chaos, the bazooka's potential was clear. The combat diary of the U.S. 1st Armored Division records that on 10 November 1942, an anti-tank team used a bazooka to knock out 2 Renault R-35s of the Vichy forces near the port of Laouti. These were light, outdated tanks, but the victory proved that an infantry squad could destroy armored vehicles without artillery or air support. From North Africa, the bazooka began to prove its worth. Early shortcomings, fragile batteries, unstable rockets, were quickly addressed in improved models like the M1A1 and later the M9. But the most important change was psychological. American soldiers who had been terrified of tanks could now stand up to them. The bazooka's arrival was not only a technological turning point, but a revolution in the infantryman's mindset. In a few short months of 1942, from a steel pipe scavenged from scrap, the bazooka made its way onto the battlefield and became a tool of victory, even General Eisenhower acknowledged. And that was only the beginning of a journey that would force the Wehrmacht to rethink its entire armored doctrine. In the spring of 1943, North Africa remained a brutal testing ground for the inexperienced U.S. Army. After relatively easy victories in Algeria and Morocco at the end of 1942, the Americans pushed deeper into Tunisia, where Rommel's Afrika Korps was still fighting fiercely. It was here that one of the fiercest battles, and also a turning point for the bazooka, took place, the Battle of Kasserine Pass. On February 14, 1943, the Germans launched an assault with more than 200 Panzer III and IFE tanks and tens of thousands of veteran troops against American lines. U.S. units collapsed in panic. Many disintegrated under the onslaught. In this desperate situation, the bazooka was tested for the first time in real combat against German armor. A few brave American teams used their bazookas to block the panzers advancing through the pass. Reports later confirmed that some rockets penetrated the side armor of Panzer IVs, igniting the crews inside. But many rounds either bounced off or detonated prematurely, as the frontal armor of the panzers was simply too thick for the early M6 rocket to pierce. Kasserine was a bitter defeat for the U.S., over 6,000 casualties, hundreds of vehicles destroyed, and thousands of prisoners taken. But for the Germans, the battle revealed something important. Among the captured equipment, they found intact bazookas. German engineers immediately sent them back home for study. Within a short time, they not only copied the weapon, but also enlarged it from 60mm to 88mm and replaced the electrical ignition with a simpler system. The result was the Raketenpanzerbüchse 43, nicknamed the Panzerschreck, the tank terror. Heavier and bulkier than the original bazooka, the Panzerschreck's 88mm rocket could penetrate up to 160mm of armor, enough to destroy even the newest Allied heavy tanks. It became a textbook example of how quickly military technology could spark an arms race. An American invention, within months, had been transformed into a lethal German weapon. Yet before the Panzerschreck appeared in large numbers, the bazooka proved its worth. In the summer of 1943, during Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, it became indispensable. Sicily's terrain, full of villages, narrow alleys, and stone walls, was perfect for the handheld launcher. One often-told story recalls American paratroopers using bazookas to destroy a German Tiger I tank near Gela. According to reports, a team ambushed the Tiger and fired multiple rounds into its flank, setting it ablaze. Historians still debate the accuracy of this claim, since the Tiger's armor was up to 100mm thick, but the psychological effect was undeniable. Even the mightiest German tank was no longer untouchable. From Sicily, bazookas moved with U.S. troops into Italy, where their versatility became even clearer. Beyond anti-tank duty, they became tools for urban combat. Infantrymen often used them to blast holes in walls, a tactic known as mouse-holing, allowing soldiers to move through buildings instead of risking streets swept by German machine guns. At Cassino Anzio and countless Italian towns, bazookas became the universal tool, smashing doors, bunkers, dugouts, and fortified gun nests. American commanders quickly grasped their tactical value. Unlike cumbersome anti-tank guns that needed vehicles to tow them, bazookas gave infantry portable armor-killing firepower, restoring battlefield balance. Eisenhower once remarked, "Without the bazooka, infantrymen felt naked before German tanks. With it, they became hunters again." The Germans, of course, did not sit idle. After the Panzerschreck, they developed the Panzerfaust, a cheap, disposable, mass-produced anti-tank weapon. Renowned for their engineering, the Germans themselves admitted their inspiration had come from the American bazooka. This alone showed how far its influence had spread. Throughout 1943, from Tunisia to Sicily to Italy, the bazooka steadily proved its value. At Kasserine, it was a newcomer. By the end of the year, nearly every U.S. infantry unit treated it as standard equipment. Production skyrocketed, from just a few thousand at the start to over 60,000 by year's end. More importantly, it transformed morale. Frontline reports stressed that American soldiers no longer fled at the sound of tank treads. Instead, they prepared ambushes. The sight of two-man bazooka teams, gunner and loader, became commonplace. Hidden behind walls, bushes, or street corners, they waited for enemy armor to close within 30-50 meters before firing. Risky, yes, but with far greater odds of success than ever before. For the Germans, the bazooka's spread was a warning. Panzers could no longer roam villages at will. General von Zenger und Etterlin, commanding German forces in Italy, later wrote, "The Americans carried small steel tubes, but enough to make an entire battalion of our tanks hesitate." By 1944, the bazooka was no longer an experiment. It was embedded in U.S. doctrine. Each infantry battalion had its own bazooka platoon, and every company had multiple teams. From North Africa to Italy, the bazooka had come a long way. From an untested gadget in the hands of untrained GIs, to an essential battlefield tool that even the Wehrmacht feared. Most striking of all, it was in North Africa and Italy that the bazooka gave birth to its greatest rival, the Panzerschreck. Proof that one simple invention could echo so powerfully, it reshaped not only the Allies' tactics, but also the enemy's. Yet far from diminishing its importance, this only confirmed the bazooka's true legacy. A small steel tube that shook the seemingly unshakable doctrines of 20th century warfare. At dawn on June 6, 1944, Allied troopships surged toward the beaches of Normandy. Behind a curtain of thunderous naval bombardment, tens of thousands of soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other nations prepared for the largest amphibious assault in history. In the heavy pack of an American infantryman, alongside his M1 Garand rifle, grenades, and light machine guns, lay a weapon that had not even existed 2 years earlier, the bazooka. More than just a tool of war, it symbolized the belief that infantry could stand against German tanks on European soil. Unlike the chaos of North Africa, this time the bazooka entered battle with a new status. The U.S. Army had standardized both equipment and training. Every infantry company carried at least 6 launchers, while engineers, paratroopers, and Marines received even more. For Operation Overlord, logistics records show that nearly 15,000 bazookas and over 500,000 rockets crossed the channel, an immense stockpile underscoring the weapon's role as indispensable on D-Day. The fighting in Normandy quickly proved that decision right. On Omaha Beach, the bloodiest landing zone, German tanks counterattacked, seeking to drive the Allies back into the sea. But this time, every American squad had a bazooka. Reports tell of Panzer Farschers halted by 2-man teams firing from sand dunes or rubble. Even at close range, often just 30 to 50 meters, the bazooka's warhead could pierce side armor, turning a fearsome machine into a burning wreck. Yet its true impact emerged inland, in the Normandy bocage, a labyrinth of thick hedgerows and earthen banks. For U.S. troops, the bocage was a nightmare of ambushes. For the Germans, it was a defensive paradise. Here, the bazooka became a lifesaver. Panthers or Panzer IVs entering narrow lanes could be ambushed from the flanks. Patient infantrymen waited until the tanks exposed their sides or rear, then a single rocket ended the threat. In the first 6 weeks of fighting, about 12% of German tanks destroyed on the American front were credited to bazookas, an extraordinary figure compared to artillery or airstrikes. Beyond tanks, the weapon reshaped tactics. Instead of calling For artillery, GIs used bazookas to blast bunkers, machine gun nests, or even punch holes in village walls to create new entry points. What had been improvised in Italy became standard practice in France. Meanwhile, U.S. industry churned out bazookas at staggering rates. From only a few thousand in 1942, production soared to hundreds of thousands by mid-1944. In that year alone, over 250,000 launchers and millions of rockets were produced. Costing less than $20 each, rockets priced like a few packs of cigarettes, the bazooka epitomized American industrial might. Compared to a German tank worth tens of thousands of dollars, its cost-effectiveness was unmatched. The Germans felt the pressure. Panthers and Tigers, built to withstand heavy anti-tank guns, now faced threats from infantry lurking in hedgerows. They added side skirts, mesh armor, and Zimmerit paste, but bazooka teams simply aimed at weaker side and rear plates. Stories like the July 1944 battle at St. Lo became legend. A U.S. platoon ambushed 3 Panthers, destroying one with a rear shot. The others fled in panic, abandoning their infantry support. Encounters like this eroded German confidence in their invincible tanks. Strategically, the bazooka slowed the blitzkrieg. German armor could no longer charge into villages without infantry cover. Every counterattack risked ambush by hidden bazooka teams, forcing panzer commanders to advance cautiously at the cost of speed and surprise. For the Allies, the psychological shift was equally vital. U.S. commanders observed that infantry no longer feared German armor. Instead, they saw tanks as prey. This confidence spread across the front, making American troops more aggressive and resilient. The bazooka had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of initiative and courage. By the liberation of Paris in August 1944, the bazooka had left its mark. It helped destroy thousands of German tanks, transformed infantry tactics, and broke the aura of armored supremacy. Cheap, portable, and deadly, it ensured that foot soldiers were no longer helpless before the Panzer. Normandy proved a lasting truth. Even a simple steel tube could reshape the armored doctrine of Nazi Germany. Forced into hasty adaptations, extra armor, new defensive tactics, the Wehrmacht found its edge dulled. But these measures came too late. The Allies had seized the initiative, and the bazooka was one of the weapons that tipped the balance in their favor. When the winter of 1944 descended upon Europe, the war entered a tense and brutal phase. After their success in Normandy, the Allies had pushed deep into France, crossed into Belgium and the Netherlands, and were only a few dozen miles from the Rhine. Many believed the war would end before Christmas. But Hitler still had one final card to play, the counteroffensive in the Ardennes, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. It would also prove the harshest trial for many Allied weapons, including the bazooka, mocked early on as a pipe-shooting fireworks, yet now the savior of countless infantry units. On December 16, 1944, hundreds of thousands of German troops surged out of the Ardennes forest, supported by more than 1,000 tanks and assault guns, among them Panthers, Panzer IVs, and the massive Tiger IIs. American infantry holding small towns along the defensive line were struck hard. Harsh winter weather grounded Allied aircraft, artillery was difficult to move, and many units were completely cut off. In that desperate situation, bazookas became one of the few weapons soldiers could rely on to halt German armor. Yet the winter battlefield also revealed the bazooka's limitations. Temperatures below 20 degrees Celsius often killed the batteries needed to ignite the rockets, forcing soldiers to keep them warm against their bodies before use. Even when fired, thick snow could deflect their trajectory. Still, despite these hardships, the bazooka proved devastating in the Ardennes close-range engagements. At Bastogne, where the U.S. 101st Airborne famously responded, "nuts," to a German surrender demand, bazookas were used extensively to hold the lines. Reports describe bazooka teams destroying Panthers and Panzer IVs at ranges of only a few dozen meters, striking their thinner side and rear armor. These reckless but determined shots allowed infantry to hang on until clear skies brought Allied air power back to dominate the battlefield. One striking example came near St. Vith, where the U.S. 7th Armored Division fought stubbornly. A single squad with just a few bazookas knocked out 3 Panzer IVs in under 10 minutes, stalling an entire German armored column. Such stories spread quickly, reinforcing the belief that even against steel behemoths, a soldier with a bazooka could make a decisive difference. Beyond Europe, bazookas found remarkably creative uses. One of the most famous tales involved Captain Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter, an American liaison pilot. Flying a tiny L-4, Grasshopper, an aircraft normally reserved for artillery spotting and communications, Carpenter mounted 6 M9 bazookas on its sides and personally fired them at German tanks and convoys. Over multiple missions, he destroyed or disabled more than a dozen armored vehicles. American newspapers celebrated him as a hero, dubbing his little plane the tank killer in the sky. Such stories highlighted the bazooka's versatility. Though designed as an anti-tank weapon, U.S. troops quickly adapted it for other roles. In urban combat, it became an efficient tool for demolishing buildings and fortifications, enabling mouse-holing, blasting openings through walls so infantry could move house to house without exposing themselves in the streets. In Italy and France, it was often used to silence MG42 nests or destroy hardened bunkers. In the Pacific, the bazooka proved invaluable in an entirely different environment. The Japanese relied less on heavy tanks, instead fortifying themselves in bunkers, caves, and underground positions. Where machine guns and grenades failed to break through, Marines brought up bazookas. On Saipan, Tinian, and Iwo Jima, hundreds of bunkers were blasted apart at close range. When the Japanese did deploy light tanks like the Type 95 Heigo or Type 97 Chiha, bazookas easily punched through, turning counterattacks into disasters. At Saipan alone, bazookas destroyed at least 28 Japanese tanks, an impressive figure for such a simple weapon. Its adaptability showed in other experiments as well. Some U.S. units mounted bazookas on jeeps to create mobile firepower. Others tried ambush tactics, firing from dug-in pits. Not every idea worked, but these improvisations showed just how trusted and indispensable the weapon had become. The Ardennes campaign ended in a catastrophic defeat for Nazi Germany. Over 600 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned, a significant portion falling victim to bazookas. Exact figures are uncertain, but post-war reports estimate bazookas accounted for 10–15% of all German tank losses in the American sector, a remarkable share for what had once been dismissed as a secondary weapon. After the Bulge, as U.S. forces advanced into Germany, the bazooka continued to see heavy use. In street fighting at Cologne, Aachen, and ultimately in the drive toward Berlin, it remained essential. German armor was still dangerous, but the combined efforts of infantry with bazookas, anti-tank guns, and air support rendered the Wehrmacht's armored edge meaningless. Looking back, the fourth chapter in the bazooka's journey is not only about specific battles, but about its extraordinary adaptability. From the frozen forests of the Ardennes to the shattered cities of Europe to the volcanic islands of the Pacific, the bazooka consistently proved its tactical worth. It was far from perfect, short-ranged, imprecise, and weather-sensitive, but its simplicity, mobility, and destructive punch made it the infantryman's Swiss Army knife. Most importantly, the bazooka transformed battlefield psychology. Once, the sight of a German tank left infantry feeling helpless, waiting for artillery or airstrikes to intervene. But from Ardennes to Bastogne, from Saipan to Iwo Jima, American soldiers could now stand tall, ready to face armor head-on. A two-man bazooka team, gunner and loader, could stop a machine weighing dozens of tons. That was the true revolution this seemingly crude weapon brought to modern warfare. When the last smoke of World War II cleared, soldiers returning from Europe and the Pacific carried countless haunting memories. Forests littered with the husks of burned-out tanks, cities reduced to rubble, blood-soaked islands. Among the thousands of weapons that had shaped the conflict, one stood out, the bazooka. Just a simple steel tube with a handful of crude mechanical parts, it left a lasting mark on military history. It not only saved lives and shifted battles, but also forged a legacy for generations of man-portable anti-tank weapons to come. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced nearly 500,000 bazookas and over 15 million rockets. Production costs were astonishingly low. A launcher cost only a few $dozen, cheaper than a heavy machine gun, let alone an anti-tank gun. A rocket cost less than $10. In stark contrast, destroying a German tank by artillery or air support could cost thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars. Economically, a Panther or Tiger II worth hundreds of thousands could be neutralized by a handful of rockets, totaling under $50, a disparity that stunned military strategists. But The true legacy of the bazooka went beyond economics. It revolutionized battlefield psychology. Before its arrival, infantry were helpless against tanks, forced to rely on grenades, Molotov cocktails, or armor-piercing bullets that barely scratched panzer armor. The appearance of a tank spread panic through the ranks. The bazooka ended that era. Now, with just 2 men, a gunner and a loader, infantry could bring down a 40-ton machine. The image of a soldier crouched in a foxhole, waiting for a tank to approach before unleashing a rocket, became a new symbol. Infantry were no longer prey, but tank hunters. This was nothing less than a tactical revolution. Post-war doctrine accepted that tanks could never again operate independently, as in the early blitzkrieg. They required infantry support to guard against ambushes, and armored thrusts into cities became far riskier. Bazookas reshaped mechanized warfare throughout the second half of the 20th century. The weapon's influence carried into its descendants. In Korea, the bazooka struggled against the Soviet T-34-85, leading to the development of the 3.5-inch M20 Super Bazooka, powerful enough to pierce Soviet armor. Its design principles, open tube, rocket-propelled heat, high-explosive anti-tank warheads, electric ignition, set the foundation for nearly all later man-portable anti-tank weapons. The U.S. went on to field the M72 LAW, a lightweight, disposable launcher used widely in Vietnam and beyond. Sweden created the Gustaf recoilless rifle. The Soviet Union, drawing lessons from the bazooka and the German Panzer, developed the RPG-2 and later the legendary RPG-7, which appeared in almost every conflict since the 1960s. All were direct heirs of the bazooka. If the tank symbolized the mechanized power of the 20th century, the bazooka symbolized its democratization, giving ordinary soldiers the means to destroy the enemy's most expensive and advanced machines. In a world of total war, where cost-effectiveness mattered, this balance was decisive. German commanders later admitted bitterly that bazookas and similar weapons had stripped the soul from blitzkrieg. Beyond tactics and technology, the bazooka embodied ingenuity under pressure. Born from a simple concept at Aberdeen Proving Ground in 1942, it went from prototype to battlefield within months. It was proof that not all great inventions were complex. Sometimes a steel tube, a bit of engineering intuition, and the will of soldiers could change history. Military historians often compare the bazooka to the Maxim machine gun. Just as the Maxim transformed trench warfare in World War I, the bazooka transformed armored warfare in World War II. It turned the relationship from tank dominance, infantry helplessness, into tank versus infantry on equal footing. Every war since 1945 has featured man-portable anti-tank weapons as a result. The bazooka even left its imprint on popular culture. In films, comics, and video games, it became shorthand for bravery and raw destructive power. Soldiers nicknamed it the magic tube, the lightning pipe, or simply the great equalizer. Its very name came from comedian Bob Burns' improvised musical instrument, an accident of culture that became a legend of war. By the late 20th century, the original bazooka had left service, replaced by modern systems like the RPG, AT-4, Javelin, and M-LAW. Yet its spirit lives on. Every guided missile and disposable launcher traces its lineage back to that simple tube. On modern battlefields, from the Middle East to Eastern Europe, its legacy remains visible. The U.S. Army's own historians summed it up best. No weapon changed the battlefield of World War II more than the bazooka. From North Africa, Italy and Normandy to the Ardennes, from Saipan and Iwo Jima to Okinawa, it proved itself in every terrain and situation. Not the sole decisive weapon, but one of the key tools of Allied victory. Above all, the bazooka left behind a timeless lesson. In war, human creativity and adaptability can forge simple tools that alter history itself. A steel tube that once seemed worthless became, in the hands of ordinary soldiers, a symbol of ingenuity, courage, and resilience. That is the enduring legacy of the bazooka, the steel tube that defeated tanks.